The bioluminescent chandeliers pulsed in rhythm with Princess Calith's heartbeat, which was unfortunate because it meant the entire hall of echoing stars could essentially see her growing irritation. The organic lighting systems, harvested from the deep caves of Verdania's southern continent, had been engineered millennia ago to respond to royal biorhythms, a feature that seemed poetic in the ancient texts, but proved remarkably inconvenient when one was trying to maintain diplomatic composure, while yet another suitor droned on about his military accomplishments. Lord Vexaris of the southern crystalline wastes knelt before her throne, his armor gleaming with embedded star fragments that probably cost more than a small moon. In his outstretched hands, he held a containment sphere filled with compressed starlight, the kind of gift that would make the court poets swoon for weeks. Calith noticed that his positioning was calculated to catch the light at exactly the right angle, casting dramatic shadows across his chiseled features. Of course it was. "Princess," he intoned, his voice carrying that particular resonance Verdanian nobles spent years perfecting. "I offer not merely my house's considerable military strength, but my very essence, to unite our people against the coming darkness." Calith's long, elegantly pointed ears, the mark of the frost-born lineage that made her porcelain skin, seemed to actually glow in certain lights, barely twitched. She'd perfected the art of appearing interested while mentally calculating how many more of these performances she'd have to endure before the Senate ran out of eligible nobles to throw at her. From her position 3 steps below the throne, Rena cleared her throat. The chief advisor's silver-streaked hair was pulled back in the traditional 7-strand braid, though several strands had escaped to frame her angular face. She'd been serving the royal family for 30 years, which meant she'd achieved the remarkable ability to convey entire paragraphs of commentary through minor throat sounds. This particular throat clear translated roughly to, "This is the 4th suitor this week, and it's only Tuesday by the human calendar system. We're not supposed to be using, but everyone does anyway." Calith allowed herself the smallest smile. "Lord Vexaris, your offer honors both me and the throne. The compressed starlight is particularly luminous. I had it extracted from the core of a dying sun," Vexaris said, managing to sound both humble and incredibly self-satisfied. "A metaphor, if you will, for how I would reignite the glory of Verdania through our union." "How poetic," Rena murmured, just loud enough for Calith to hear. "Also how conveniently it ignores that we have 17 stellar mining operations that could produce identical samples for a fraction of the cost and 0 mythological significance." Calith pressed her lips together to avoid laughing, which would have caused the chandeliers to shift through the entire spectrum in a decidedly un-princess-like display. Instead, she rose from her throne with the fluid grace that came from a lifetime of movement training. Her gown, woven from quantum-aligned silk that shifted between deep blue and violet depending on the observer's position, flowed around her like liquid midnight. "The Senate and I will consider your generous proposal," she said, deploying the formal phrases she'd used so many times they'd lost all meaning. In these uncertain times, with the void swarm's advance threatening all civilized worlds, unity among our houses is indeed paramount. Vexaris stood, bowed with mathematical precision, and withdrew backward the required 15 paces before turning. Calith watched him go, noting how he'd positioned his exit to give the court's observers maximum opportunity to admire his profile. The man had probably choreographed this entire presentation. As the massive crystalline doors sealed behind him with their characteristic harmonic chime, Calith let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, responding to her relief. "That's what the 9th proposal this month?" Rena asked, ascending the steps to stand beside the throne. "Or have I lost count?" 11th, Calith corrected, sinking back into her seat. Though in Lord Vexaris's defense, he's the first one who didn't try to work a demonstration of his combat prowess into the presentation. "Remember Lord Calthar, the one who challenged your honor guard to a duel to prove his worthiness. Rena's expression suggested she remembered very well. Your guards were very professional about absolutely demolishing him. Captain Shen did seem to enjoy that. Kalith rubbed her temples, careful not to disturb the circlet of woven starlight that rested against her raven-black hair. The Senate wants an answer soon. All of them want answers. The Senate wants you to pick someone, anyone, so they can check royal marriage off their political crisis management list. Rena moved to the throne room's observation window, where Verdania's capital city spread out below them in spirals of crystalline architecture and floating gardens. They think a wedding will unite the houses against the void swarm threat. And what do you think? Rena turned, her weathered face thoughtful. I think the ancient prophecy your tutors made you memorize says the last Frostborn princess will save Verdania through a bond, forged in fire from beyond the veil. And none of these perfumed nobles make anything resembling fire. They're all ice just like us. Kalith had spent countless nights in the Temple of First Light, studying those prophecies by the glow of the eternal flames. The words were etched into crystal tablets older than Verdania's recorded history, written in a dialect so archaic that half the translations were guesswork. But that phrase, forged in fire from beyond the veil, had haunted her dreams since childhood. Prophecies are metaphorical, she said, though she didn't sound convinced. Of course they are, right up until they're not. Rena paused. Speaking of things from beyond the veil, did you hear? The humans requested an audience. Kalith blinked. Humans from Earth. The very same. Apparently they want to discuss a military alliance against the Void Swarm. Rena's tone suggested she found the entire concept amusing. Your father is already planning the reception. Should be entertaining. I understand they don't even have biorhythmic architecture. Before Kalith could respond, the chamber's communication crystal flared to life, projecting her father's face in miniature. King Thuron looked exhausted, the weight of his years showing in lines that hadn't been there a decade ago. Kalith, he said without preamble, we need to discuss the human delegation. They arrive tomorrow. Tomorrow? Kalith stood again. That's remarkably short notice for a diplomatic visit. They claim it's urgent. The Void Swarm has apparently been attacking their outer colonies as well. Her father's image flickered slightly. The crystals needed recalibration again. The Senate sees opportunity here. A formal alliance with Earth could bring resources we desperately need. And you want me to? Kalith trailed off, already knowing the answer. I want you to assess their commander, see if he's someone we can trust. A pause. The Senate wants me to assess if he's someone suitable for other considerations. Father, they're human. They're potential allies with a fleet and combat experience against the swarm. In times like these, we consider all possibilities. The king's expression softened. Just meet with them, Kalith. Use that sharp mind of yours. We need to know if Earth's offer is genuine or if this is some elaborate political maneuvering. The communication crystal dimmed, leaving Kalith and Rena alone in the throne room. The chandeliers had shifted to a contemplative blue-green, reflecting Kalith's churning thoughts. Humans, Rena said thoughtfully. Well, at least they'll be different from the usual suitors. I hear they're remarkably unimpressed by crystalline architecture and don't even have a proper Senate structure. This should be refreshing. Kalith moved to the window, looking out at the twin moons rising over Verdania's spires. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of known space, the Void Swarm was advancing. And tomorrow, visitors from a world her people had once dismissed as primitive backwater would arrive seeking alliance. Fire from beyond the veil, she murmured. What? Nothing. Kalith turned from the window. Just wondering if prophecies ever come with instruction manuals. Rena laughed, the sound echoing through the hall of echoing stars. If they did, my job would be significantly easier. Come on, we should review the diplomatic protocols for human contact. I believe the last update was about 3 centuries ago, which means it's probably completely useless. As they left the throne room together, Neither noticed the distant sensors registering unusual quantum signatures at the system's edge, the telltale traces of void swarm scouts, watching and waiting. The Prometheus came out of quantum slip with all the grace of a drunken asteroid, its hull shuddering in a way that made Lieutenant Sarah Chen grip her console and mutter something about outdated slipspace drives that Commander Darius Kane pretended not to hear. "Smooth as always, boss," Chen said, her fingers dancing across the navigation array as Verdania's orbital platform materialized on their view screen. The structure looked like someone had convinced a snowflake to mate with a space station, and somehow made it work. All crystalline spires and impossible geometry that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at it. Darius leaned back in his command chair, the worn leather protesting with a familiar creak. 3 months ago, this chair had belonged to Captain Morrison. 2 months ago, Morrison had died along with 60% of their crew when the void swarm tore through the Kepler station defenses. Now Darius sat here, wearing a commander's insignia he'd never wanted and piloting a ship held together mostly by spite and emergency hull patches. "Verdania Control, this is Earth vessel Prometheus requesting docking clearance," he transmitted, keeping his voice professionally neutral. "We're here for the diplomatic summit that your people requested. Eventually, after 3 weeks of subspace message ping-pong about proper protocol formats." Chen shot him a look that clearly said, "Maybe don't insult our potential allies before we even dock." But Darius caught the hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. The response came in a voice so melodious it made their ship's audio system sound like a garbage disposal. "Prometheus, you are cleared for docking Bay 7. Please be advised that our atmospheric composition includes trace amounts of luminescent spores. They are harmless to most carbon-based life forms." "Most," Chen muttered. "We appreciate the heads up," Darius replied. "We'll try not to breathe too enthusiastically." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Darius wondered if Verdanian translators struggled with sarcasm. Then, "Your humor is," noted Commander Kane. "Welcome to Verdania." The docking procedure took 20 minutes, during which Darius watched the crystalline structures of the platform grow larger on their screens. Everything about this place screamed ancient civilization with technology you don't understand. From the energy shields that rippled like soap bubbles to the gardens, actual gardens, floating in geometric patterns between the station's arms. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" Chen asked as they descended toward the docking bay. "When have you ever waited for permission, Lieutenant?" "Fair point." She pulled up a file on her secondary screen. "I've been reading the cultural briefing on Verdanian society. Did you know they consider it extremely rude to make direct eye contact with royalty unless specifically invited?" "I did not know that. I also don't particularly care." "I was afraid you'd say that." Chen sighed. "Also, their Senate operates on a consensus model that can take weeks to reach decisions. They have 17 different levels of formal address depending on social hierarchy, and their concept of personal space is approximately 3 times larger than ours." "So what you're telling me is that every instinct I have about how to interact with people will offend them?" "Pretty much, yeah." The Prometheus settled into the docking bay, with a final shudder that Darius chose to interpret as the ship sighing in relief. Through the viewport, he could see a welcoming committee assembling. A dozen figures in flowing robes that seemed to be made of woven light, standing in formation that probably had deep ceremonial significance. "Right," Darius stood, tugging his uniform jacket straight. The fabric was military-issue gray, patched in 3 places, and looked aggressively practical compared to everything he could see outside. "Let's go accidentally insult an entire civilization." "That's the spirit, sir." The airlock cycled open and Darius got his first breath of Verdanian atmosphere. Chen was right about the spores. He could see tiny motes of light drifting through the air like microscopic stars. The air itself tasted faintly of ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. The welcoming committee's leader stepped forward, a tall figure with elaborate robes and facial markings that glowed faintly blue. His ears were elongated and pointed, sweeping back from his head in elegant curves that Darius's tired brain immediately compared to satellite dishes. "Commander Darius Kane of Earth," the Verdanian said, his voice carrying that same musical quality as the docking controller. "I am Ambassador Thuris. On behalf of King Thuron and the Verdanian Senate, I welcome you to our system." Darius extended his hand, before remembering that handshakes might not be a thing here. Thuris looked at the outstretched hand with an expression that suggested he'd just been presented with a small, confused animal. "It's a greeting gesture," Chen supplied helpfully from behind Darius. "We clasp hands. It's meant to show we're not carrying weapons." Thuris gingerly reached out and gripped Darius's hand with the uncertainty of someone defusing a bomb. "How practical." "That's us," Darius said, "relentlessly practical. Your station is impressive, by the way. We don't have anything like it. Our orbital platforms are basically metal boxes with docking clamps." "I see." Thuris withdrew his hand and gestured toward an archway that seemed to be made of solidified light. "If you would follow me, the king awaits in the Hall of Echoing Stars. There are certain protocols we must observe before the formal audience." "How many protocols are we talking about?" Darius asked as they started walking. "Because I should mention that my entire diplomatic training consisted of a 2-hour seminar and a pamphlet titled "Don't Start Wars." Chen made a strangled sound behind him. Thuris's expression remained diplomatically neutral. "I will endeavor to simplify matters where possible." The corridor they entered defied several laws of physics that Darius was pretty sure were supposed to be non-negotiable. The walls curved in directions that made his eyes hurt, and the floor had a disconcerting habit of adjusting its level to match his stride, like walking on a treadmill that anticipated his movements. "So," Darius said, because silence made him uncomfortable and he'd already committed to being the awkward human, "the Void Swarm. Your people have encountered them. 3 weeks ago, they destroyed an outer mining colony." Thuris's musical voice went flat. 2,000 souls lost. Our defense fleet drove them back, but the Senate believes this was merely a probe of our capabilities. "Sounds familiar. They hit our Kepler station 2 months back. Came out of nowhere, tore through our defenses like they weren't there." Darius kept his voice steady, professional. No need to mention the nightmares, the way he still heard Morrison's final transmission sometimes when he closed his eyes. "We're still trying to understand their tactics. They adapt fast." "Indeed." Thuris paused before another doorway, this one framed by columns that seemed to grow from the floor like crystalline trees. "The Senate is divided on how to respond. Some advocate fortification, others expansion of our defensive perimeter. Your arrival has introduced a third option: alliance with the scrappy humans who showed up in a patched-together frigate." Darius smiled without humor. "I'm sure that's going over well with the traditionalists." "You are perceptive, Commander." Thuris touched the doorway and it irised open, revealing a chamber that made the corridor look understated. "I will leave you here to prepare. An attendant will brief you on the proper forms of address and ceremonial expectations." The attendant turned out to be a young Verdanian woman who looked absolutely terrified of the humans. She led Darius and Chen through a bewildering series of protocols involving specific standing positions, acceptable vocal tones, and the 17 different ways to bow depending on who you were addressing. "Okay, so if I understand correctly," Chen said after the 15th explanation, "we bow at 45 degrees for the king, 30 degrees for Senate members, and 15 degrees for the princess, unless she's standing within the ceremonial circle, in which case we don't bow but we also don't make eye contact unless she blinks twice." The attendant looked relieved that someone was taking notes. "Yes, precisely. You learn quickly." "We're going to mess this up so badly," Chen whispered to Darius. "Spectacularly," he agreed. 20 minutes later, they stood at the entrance to the Hall of Echoing Stars, and Darius had to admit that echoing was probably underselling it. The chamber was vast enough to have its own weather system, its ceiling lost in a shimmer of bioluminescent light that pulsed in patterns he couldn't quite follow. At the far end, on a throne that looked carved from a single enormous crystal, sat King Thuron. He was old, Darius could see that even from this distance, but he held himself with the kind of presence that made age irrelevant. And beside the throne, standing with a posture that suggested both perfect composure and carefully controlled irritation, was a woman whose porcelain-white skin seemed to collect the ambient light. Her raven-black hair fell past her shoulders, and her ears swept back in those same elegant points that marked all the Verdanians. She wore a gown that shifted colors as Darius watched, and her dark eyes tracked his approach with an intelligence that made him suddenly very aware that he was about to present Earth's case to people who probably considered his entire species to be recent arrivals on the galactic stage. Princess Caliph, he presumed. Darius was supposed to bow at 45 degrees. Instead, he met her eyes directly. He'd never been good at following rules that didn't make sense to him, and saw her posture shift almost imperceptibly. Surprise, annoyance. He couldn't tell. "Your Majesty," he said, addressing the king but acutely aware that the princess's gaze hadn't left him. "I'm Commander Darius Kane. I'm here because humanity is getting its ass kicked by the Void Swarm, and I suspect you are too. I think we can help each other. I think we should stop being polite and start being honest about what we're up against." The chandeliers flared bright gold, then deep crimson, then settled into an uncertain purple. Jen beside him had her eyes closed like she was praying, and Princess Caliph, for the first time in months, smiled. The temple gardens occupied a space that shouldn't have existed according to any reasonable understanding of architecture. Caliph had grown up walking these paths and still couldn't explain how they managed to be simultaneously indoors and under open sky, how the ancient trees grew from floor panels that were demonstrably only 3 inches thick, or why the fountain at the center flowed upward before cascading back down in defiance of gravity. "Your people really committed to the make everything confusing aesthetic," Darius said, ducking under a branch that had decided to grow horizontally across the path at exactly head height for humans. Caliph glanced back at him, fighting the urge to smile. 3 days of negotiations had established that Commander Kane was constitutionally incapable of being impressed by anything, which the Senate found either refreshing or insulting, depending on which faction you asked. The gardens were designed 5,000 years ago as a neutral meeting ground, she explained. Ancient protocol demands that discussions of war and alliance occur beneath the witness of stars. We're inside a space station. Hence the quantum ceiling panels that create a real-time projection of actual stellar positions. Caliph gestured upward where Verdania's twin moons hung in a sky that somehow existed inside a building. "It's considered very advanced." "It's considered very extra," Lieutenant Chen muttered from behind them, where she walked alongside Rena. The two of them had bonded over shared exasperation with their respective leaders, and now communicated primarily through sighs. The negotiation table, which was actually a living tree that had been convinced through genetic modification to grow in the shape of a table, sat in the garden's heart. Spread across its surface were holographic displays showing fleet positions, resource allocations, and the expanding threat perimeter of the Void Swarm. Caliph took her seat with practiced grace. Darius dropped into his chair like he'd just finished a 20-hour shift, which he probably had. She'd learned that humans required significantly less sleep than Verdanians, but somehow always looked more tired. "Right," Darius pulled up a tactical display, his fingers moving across the holographic interface with casual expertise. "Let's talk about what we're actually dealing with. The Void Swarm doesn't behave like any enemy force we've encountered. No supply lines, no apparent command structure, no communications we can intercept. They operate as a collective consciousness," Caliph added, expanding the display to show engagement patterns from Verdanian encounters. Each drone is simultaneously independent and part of the whole. Destroy one, and the others adapt. Destroy 1,000, and they evolve new tactics within hours. Which is why traditional warfare doesn't work. Darius highlighted 3 battle sites where conventional fleet tactics had failed catastrophically. You can't cut off their head because they don't have one. You can't starve them out because they don't need supply lines. They just keep coming. The Senate's preferred strategy is fortification, Caliph said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. Build stronger defenses, fall back to core systems, wait for them to lose interest. But do they lose interest? No. Then that's a terrible strategy. Darius leaned back, and Caliph noticed the way his uniform pulled tight across his shoulders, the careful way he moved his left arm like it had been injured and hadn't quite healed right. Earth's approach has been hit and run. We can't match them in direct combat, so we don't try. We strike supply convoys. They don't have supply convoys. Construction sites, staging areas, anything that looks like infrastructure. He grinned, and it transformed his entire face from grim soldier to something dangerously close to charming. Turns out the swarm hates it when you blow up their stuff and vanish before they can respond. Caliph pulled up Earth's combat records, studying the engagement patterns. Unorthodox didn't begin to cover it. Human forces fought like they had nothing to lose, which, given the state of their fleet, was probably accurate. Your tactics are effective but unsustainable, she observed. You've lost, 30% of your remaining ships in the last month. 32%. Darius's voice went flat. But we're still here, and we've delayed their advance into human space by 3 weeks. That's 3 weeks for evacuations, for building new defenses, for finding allies. He met her eyes directly, something that still made her pulse quicken in a way she refused to examine. For finding you. Before Caliph could respond, the garden's warning crystals chimed. Rena stepped forward, her datapad glowing with an urgent message. Apologies for the interruption, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry. The Senate has requested Princess Caliph's presence for an emergency session. Lord Vexaris has returned with concerning intelligence about swarm movements. Caliph felt the familiar weight settle back onto her shoulders. Can it wait? The Senate Majority Leader used the word immediately 3 times in one sentence, so I'm going to say no. Darius was already standing. Go, we can continue this later. Commander Kane, you should join us, Caliph said, making the decision quickly. If Vexaris has intelligence about the swarm, Earth needs to hear it. The Senate chamber made the Hall of Echoing Stars look understated, which Caliph would have thought impossible. Representatives from all 17 major houses sat in a spiral pattern that supposedly represented the harmony of Verdanian society, but mostly just made it difficult to see who was speaking. Lord Vexaris stood at the chamber's center, his armor freshly polished, and his expression suggesting he'd been practicing this presentation in front of a mirror. Probably multiple mirrors arranged at flattering angles. Detected at the outer rim, he was saying as they entered. 3 swarm hive ships, accompanied by at least 50 support vessels. They're establishing a staging ground in the Caliph system. The Senate erupted into overlapping conversations, each house's representatives trying to shout their opinions over everyone else's. Caliph took her designated seat, aware of Darius standing behind her in the observers section, probably deeply confused by what passed for Verdanian political discourse. The solution is obvious, Vexaris continued, raising his voice over the chaos. We must consolidate our forces, unite the houses under a single banner. He turned to look directly at Caliph, and she knew what was coming before he said it. Unite through the bond of royal marriage. Oh, here we go, Rena muttered. Princess Caliph, Vexaris addressed her formally, his voice carrying that rehearsed quality she'd come to loathe. In this hour of darkness, I renew my suit for your hand. My house commands the largest fleet in the outer territories. Through our union we could. Lord Vexaris, Caliph interrupted, keeping her voice level. I appreciate your concern for Verdania's security. However, I don't see how a wedding addresses the immediate tactical problem of 3 hive ships establishing a forward base. It addresses unity, Senator Kalme spoke up from the 3rd spiral. It addresses the ancient prophecies that speak of the Frostborn princess uniting our people. The prophecies are metaphorical, Kalith said, hearing the exhaustion in her own voice. Are they? This from Senator Iris, who loved prophecies almost as much as she loved making Kalith's life difficult. The last Frostborn princess will forge a bond that saves Verdania. Those aren't my words, princess. They're carved in the Temple of First Light. From behind her, Kalith heard Chen whisper to Darius, "Is this normal? Please tell me this isn't normal." "I have no frame of reference," Darius whispered back. "But I'm pretty sure debating ancient prophecies while enemy ships are literally at your doorstep is a bad idea regardless of culture." Several senators turned to glare at the humans for interrupting, which Darius met with a shrug that somehow managed to be both apologetic and completely unapologetic. King Thuron raised his hand for silence, and the chamber gradually quieted. The commander raises a valid point. We face an immediate threat. Lord Vexaris, what is your assessment of swarm capabilities in the Kalith system? Vexaris looked annoyed at having his dramatic marriage proposal interrupted by tactical concerns, but he pulled up a holographic display. Based on observed construction patterns, they'll have a fully operational forward base within 2 weeks. From there, they can strike any of our outer colonies within 3 days. Then we hit them before they finish building, Darius said, stepping forward despite several senators gasping at his breach of protocol. "Sorry, am I not supposed to talk? Because back home, when someone says the enemy is building a base, we generally discuss blowing it up before they finish." "The human speaks sense," Senator Vexian said from the 7th spiral. "Why are we discussing marriages when we should be discussing fleet deployments?" "Because marriages provide unity," Vexaris snapped, "which provides strength, which the humans with their patchwork fleet and desperate tactics clearly don't understand." Darius smiled, and Kalith recognized it as the expression he wore right before saying something that would either be brilliant or get them both killed. "You're right, we don't understand. That's why we've only managed to delay the swarm's advance for 3 weeks with a fraction of your resources. Clearly our lack of unity is the problem, not your Senate's inability to make a decision in less than a month." The chamber exploded into argument. Chen had her face in her hands. Rena was trying very hard not to laugh, and Kalith, looking at this blunt human who just insulted an entire chamber of Verdanian senators without even trying, felt something shift in her chest. He was right. They were arguing about prophecies and politics while people died. "Enough," she stood, and the chandeliers flared in response to her agitation. "Commander Kane is correct. We're wasting time. Lord Vexaris, prepare your fleet for a joint operation. Father, I request permission to coordinate with Earth forces on tactical planning." King Thuron studied her for a long moment. "Granted. But Kalith, the Senate's concerns about unity are not without merit. Then we'll find unity through action, not ceremony." She turned to face Darius. "Commander, I believe you mentioned something about blowing things up before the enemy finishes building them. Let's discuss specifics." As they left the chamber together, Kalith heard Senator Iris mutter something about prophecies and fire from beyond the veil. She ignored it, probably. The alert came at 3 in the morning by Verdanian time, which Darius had learned was actually closer to 5 hours than the 24 he was used to. But his body had given up trying to adjust and settled for permanent exhaustion instead. "Commander," Chen's voice crackled through his comm unit, pulling him from a dream about the Kepler station that he'd been having too often lately. "We've got a situation." Darius was pulling on his boots before his brain fully engaged. "What kind of situation?" The swarm hit Verdania's outer colony at Thesson 7. Complete surprise attack. Initial reports say they bypassed 3 defensive perimeters without triggering any alarms. He was moving before she finished, the corridors of Verdania's guest quarters blurring past as he headed for the command center. The crystalline walls pulsed with emergency lighting, bathing everything in urgent amber. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear alarms that sounded like music, because of course the Verdanians had made their crisis notifications melodic. The command center was chaos masquerading as controlled panic. Holographic displays showed Thesan 7 orbital space filled with swarm vessels, their organic-looking ships moving in patterns that made Darius's tactical instincts scream. Senator representatives shouted over each other, while military commanders tried to coordinate a response that kept getting overruled by political concerns. Caliph stood at the center of it all, her face pale but composed, arguing with 3 senators simultaneously while tracking fleet positions with one hand and adjusting defensive calculations with the other. Her hair was pulled back hastily, and she was still wearing what looked like sleeping clothes under a hastily donned formal robe. Darius had never found exhaustion attractive before, but apparently there was a first time for everything. "Cannot simply abandon the colony," she was saying, her voice cutting through the noise. "There are 15,000 civilians on Thesan 7. The fleet isn't ready for a major engagement," Senator Calmes countered. "We need time to coordinate with the outer houses, to bring Lord Vexaris's forces into position, by which time everyone on that colony will be dead." Caliph's eyes found Darius across the room, and something passed between them. A recognition, maybe, that they were the only 2 people in this room who'd actually fought the swarm and understood what delay meant. Darius pushed through the crowd to reach the central tactical display. "How many swarm ships?" "Preliminary scans show 12 attack cruisers and 1 hive ship," a Verdanian commander reported, his elongated ears twitching with stress. "They're establishing an orbital blockade while ground forces begin planetary assault." 12 cruisers. Darius studied the formation, his mind already running calculations. "That's a scouting force, not a full invasion. They're testing your response time, seeing how fast you can mobilize." "Then we must not disappoint them." Lord Vexaris strode into the command center, his armor gleaming despite the early hour. Either he slept in full battle gear or he had incredibly efficient attendants. "Princess Caliph, I can have my fleet here within 8 hours. We strike with overwhelming force, drive them back, demonstrate Verdanian strength." 8 hours, Caliph repeated quietly. "How many people do you think will die in 8 hours? Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for—" "Don't," her voice dropped to something dangerous. "Don't finish that sentence." Darius cleared his throat, drawing attention before the argument could escalate. "The Prometheus is already in system. We've got limited firepower, but we're fast and we know swarm tactics. Give me 2 Verdanian frigates with experienced crews, and I can break that blockade long enough to evacuate the colony." The room went silent. Senator Iris actually laughed, though it sounded more like disbelief than humor. "You want to take 3 ships against 12 swarm cruisers and a hive ship," Vexaris said slowly, as if explaining things to a child. "That's not bravery, Commander. That's suicide with extra steps." "It's a calculated risk with acceptable odds," Darius corrected. "The swarm expects you to either mass your forces or abandon the colony. They won't expect a small strike force to punch through their blockade because it's tactically insane. Which is exactly why it'll work. And if you're wrong—" King Thuron had entered quietly, his presence immediately commanding attention despite his evident exhaustion. "If you fail, we lose 3 ships and any chance of rescue. If we wait 8 hours, we lose 15,000 people and the swarm learns they can strike your colonies with impunity." Darius met the king's eyes. "Your Majesty, I lost most of my crew to these things. I've seen what happens when you hesitate. The swarm doesn't negotiate, doesn't wait, doesn't give second chances. You either hit them fast or you lose." Caliph stepped forward. "I'm going with him." The room erupted. Darius, Chen, Rena, the king, and at least 7 senators all said absolutely not in various languages and volumes simultaneously. Princess, that's completely out of the question, King Thuron said firmly. You're the last of the Frostborn line. Your safety is paramount. My safety is irrelevant if I'm the princess of a dead civilization. Calith's expression was set in a way that Darius was starting to recognize meant she'd already made her decision and arguing was pointless. I know our defensive systems better than anyone. I spent 3 years studying fleet tactics in the outer territories, and the people of Thesson 7 need to see that their princess fights for them, not from the safety of a command center. This is madness, Vixaris protested. We should wait, coordinate properly, strike with our full strength once my fleet arrives. Your fleet, Calith said quietly, or your proposal. Because I'm starting to wonder if your concern is for Verdania or for your political prospects. Vixaris's face darkened. You question my honor. I question your timing. She turned to her father. I'm going. You can either assign me 2 frigates with competent crews, or I'll take a shuttle and improvise. Rena made a sound like she was choking. Your Highness, please tell me you're joking about the shuttle. Do I look like I'm joking? No, which is what worries me. King Thuron closed his eyes briefly, and Darius saw the weight of impossible choices settle on the old king's shoulders. Very well. Captain Shen, prepare the Starfire and the Morning Tide. Princess Calith will command the operation alongside Commander Kane. He opened his eyes, looking at his daughter with something between pride and terror. Bring them home, all of them. 20 minutes later, Darius stood on the Prometheus bridge while Chen ran pre-flight checks with the kind of manic energy that meant she was terrified and channeling it into competence. Sir, I feel obligated to point out that this plan is insane, she said, her fingers flying across the navigation console. Noted. Like genuinely insane. We're going to fly 3 ships at a swarm blockade that's designed to stop entire fleets. Also noted. And we're doing this with a Verdanian princess on board, which means if we die, we're not just dead, we're diplomatically dead, which is somehow worse. Lieutenant Chen. Yes, sir. Shut up and fly the ship. She grinned despite herself. Yes, sir. The comm crackled to life with Calith's voice. She changed into what Darius assumed was Verdanian combat gear, form-fitting armor that looked ceremonial but probably had defensive capabilities his equipment could only dream of. Prometheus, this is Starfire. We're ready when you are. Copy that, Starfire. Morning Tide confirmed status. Morning Tide ready, Captain Shen's gruff voice responded. Commander Kane, I've been flying combat missions since before your planet had FTL. Please try not to get us all killed. I'll do my best. They broke orbit in tight formation. The Prometheus flanked by 2 Verdanian frigates that made his ship look like a particularly ugly metal box. The contrast would have been funny if they weren't heading into combat that had better than even odds of killing everyone involved. Quantum slip in 3, Chen announced. 2, 1. Reality twisted sideways, and Thesson 7 orbital space snapped into existence around them. The swarm blockade was even worse up close. 12 attack cruisers arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that would make breaking through a nightmare. And behind them, the hive ship pulsed with bioluminescent energy that made Darius's skin crawl. Well, he said conversationally, this is going to be interesting. That's one word for it, Chen muttered. Calith's voice came through the comm, steady despite what they were facing. Starfire to all ships, I've run the calculations. There's a weak point in their formation at coordinates 37 Mark 9. If we hit it simultaneously at maximum velocity, we can punch through before they adjust. And if they adjust faster than you calculated, Darius asked, then we'll know very quickly. He couldn't help it, he laughed. Chen looked at him like he'd lost his mind, which was fair. All ships, Darius ordered, weapons hot, shields maximum. We're going in fast and coming out faster. Anyone who wants to say a prayer to whatever deity they prefer, now's the time. The Verdanian prayer for battle is 17 verses long, Captain Shen noted. Then skip to the good parts. Chen, punch it. The Prometheus accelerated toward the swarm blockade, flanked by 2 Verdanian frigates, and carrying the weight of 15,000 lives that depended on 3 ships and a plan that was, as Chen had accurately noted, genuinely insane. The swarm noticed them, and the first shots lit up the void like deadly fireworks as all 12 cruisers opened fire simultaneously. The swarm's weapons fire-painted space in colors that shouldn't exist, organic energy pulses that seemed to bend light around them before streaking toward the Prometheus with lethal precision. Chen yanked the ship into a dive that made the inertial dampeners scream in protest, and Darius felt his stomach attempt to relocate to somewhere near his spine. "Shields at 60%, Chen reported, her voice remarkably steady for someone performing evasive maneuvers that would make a test pilot weep. "We're not going to survive many more hits like that." "We don't need to survive many more," Darius said, watching the tactical display as the Verdanian frigates laid down covering fire that turned 2 swarm cruisers into expanding clouds of debris. "We just need to survive long enough." Calith's voice cut through the chaos. "Starfire breaking left, drawing fire from the hive ship. Morning tide, target their coordination node at bearing 270. "You want me to shoot at what now?" Captain Shen sounded incredulous. "The growth on their primary hull that looks like a tumor, that's how they coordinate fleet movements. Trust me." There was a pause filled only by weapons fire and the sound of Chen muttering what might have been prayers or creative profanity. Then, "Targeting the space tumor. This is either brilliant or we're all about to die learning something interesting." The Morning Tide's main cannon fired, and the coordination node exploded in a burst of bioluminescent fluid that sprayed across 3 nearby cruisers. Immediately, the swarm's perfect formation began to fragment, ships drifting slightly out of position as they lost synchronized guidance. "That actually worked," Darius said, genuinely surprised. "I spent 3 years studying swarm biology," Calith replied, and he could hear the smile in her voice even through the calm static. "Now punch through before they adapt." The Prometheus shot through the gap in the formation, the 2 Verdanian frigates flanking it like lethal escorts. Plasma fire scorched their shields, warning alarms created a symphony of imminent disaster, and for 3 seconds Darius was certain they'd miscalculated and were about to die in a very spectacular fashion. Then they were through, and Thesson 7 filled the viewscreen, its surface dotted with cities that were currently under assault by swarm ground forces. "Evacuation window is open," Darius transmitted to the colony. "You've got 30 minutes before that blockade reorganizes. Get everyone to the spaceports now." The colony's response was a garbled mess of gratitude and panic, but Darius could see evacuation ships beginning to lift off from multiple landing zones. The Prometheus and its escort took up defensive positions, picking off swarm attack craft that tried to intercept the fleeing civilians. "Incoming," Chen warned. "The hive ship is breaking through. They're angry. Can't imagine why." Darius targeted a cluster of swarm fighters that were harassing an evacuation transport. "Starfire, Morning Tide, we need to buy these people more time." "Already on it," Calith replied, her frigate executing a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for a ship that size, positioning itself between the hive ship and the evacuation fleet. "Commander, I'm detecting something unusual. The hive ship is charging some kind of weapon system. Energy signature is off the charts." Darius pulled up the scans and felt his blood run cold. "That's a planet killer. They're going to sterilize the entire colony rather than let anyone escape." "How long until it fires?" 4 minutes, maybe less." There was a beat of silence. Then Calith's voice came through, calm and steady in a way that made Darius's chest tighten. "I have an idea, but you're going to hate it. Try me. The Temple of First Light on Verdania. The prophecy I mentioned. I've spent my entire life studying it, and I think I finally understand what it means." She was talking fast now, excited despite the circumstances. It's not metaphorical, it's instructions. The Frostborn lineage has a genetic marker that resonates with Verdania's ancient defensive network, but it needs an activation catalyst, a specific energy signature that doesn't exist naturally in our people. Caliph, we're kind of in the middle of something here. The energy signature of someone from beyond Verdania, someone whose biology is fundamentally different from ours, someone like a human. She paused. The prophecy isn't about marriage or politics. It's about quantum resonance between incompatible genetic structures, creating an activation key for a weapon system our ancestors built, and then forgot how to use. Darius blinked. Are you telling me your ancient mystical prophecy is actually a user manual? I'm telling you that if we survive this, we need to get to the temple immediately. But first, we need to survive this. The hive ship's weapon was nearly charged, and the last evacuation transports were still struggling to achieve orbit. Darius made a decision that was either tactically brilliant or proof that spending time with Caliph had affected his judgment. All ships, concentrate fire on the hive ship's weapon array. We can't destroy it, but maybe we can delay it. Or make it angry enough to shoot us instead of the planet, Chen added helpfully. That too. The three ships unleashed everything they had. The Prometheus's railguns, designed for precision strikes, hammered the hive ship's charging weapon. The Verdanian frigate's energy cannons carved glowing scars across its organic hull. And for a moment, it actually seemed to be working. Then the hive ship fired, not at the planet, at the starsphere. Shields won't hold, Caliph's voice was calm despite the alarm klaxons Darius could hear in the background. It's been an honor, Commander Kane. Like hell it has. Darius yanked the Prometheus into a trajectory that Chen clearly thought was suicidal, putting his ship directly between the hive ship's weapon and Caliph's frigate. Chen, emergency power to forward shields. Everything we've got. Sir, we can't. Do it. The beam hit them like the fist of an angry god. The Prometheus's shields held for approximately 2 seconds before collapsing, and then the ship was spinning, systems failing, emergency lighting painting everything in emergency red. Darius tasted blood and realized he'd bitten his tongue. Hull breach on decks 3 and 4, Chen reported, her voice shaking. Life support failing. We're dead in the water. But the Starfire was intact, and the last evacuation transport was clearing the atmosphere. Prometheus, respond. Caliph's voice was frantic in a way he'd never heard before. Darius, please respond. We're alive, he managed. Ship's not doing great, but we're alive. You magnificent idiot. She was laughing and possibly crying. Morning tide, cover the Prometheus. I'm coming around to tractor them out. The hive ship is retreating, Captain Shen reported, sounding surprised. Their ground forces are pulling back. Looks like losing their weapon system, and a third of their cruisers convinced them this wasn't worth the effort. Darius leaned back in his command chair, which was now sparking ominously. Thesson 7, what's your evacuation status? Final transport away, the colony administrator responded. Commander Kane, Princess Caliph, we owe you our lives, all 15,000 of us. 3 hours later, after emergency repairs had rendered the Prometheus marginally less likely to explode, Darius stood in the Temple of First Light beside Caliph. The structure was ancient beyond measure, its walls covered in crystalline script that glowed faintly in the eternal flames. Here, Caliph pointed to a section of text. This describes the resonance pattern needed to activate the defensive network. It's been here the entire time, and we've been interpreting it as poetry about spiritual bonds, when it's actually instructions for turning on a very large gun. More like a planetary shield network that can disable swarm hive minds within a 5 light-year radius. But yes, essentially a very large gun. Rena, who had insisted on accompanying them despite looking like she desperately needed sleep, cleared her throat. So when the prophecy said the Frostborn princess would save Verdania through a bond forged in fire from beyond the veil, it meant I needed to find someone whose genetic structure could complement mine to activate an ancient weapon system. Someone from beyond our known space. Caliph looked at Darius and her expression was complicated. Someone human. That's possibly the least romantic interpretation of a prophecy I've ever heard. Chen observed from where she stood with King Thuron and several Senate members who'd insisted on witnessing this. I don't know, Darius said slowly. I think there's something kind of romantic about weaponized quantum genetics. Caliph laughed, the sound echoing in the ancient temple. You would think that. The activation process turned out to be surprisingly simple once you had the instruction manual. Caliph placed her hand on one crystalline panel, Darius placed his on the corresponding panel, and the entire temple lit up like someone had plugged in a galaxy. Energy arced between them, and Darius felt something fundamental shift in the air. Across Verdania, ancient satellites that had been dormant for millennia powered up, creating a web of quantum disruption that would make swarm coordination impossible within the system. When the light faded, Caliph was still standing beside him, her hand still touching his on the crystal panel. Their eyes met, and Darius saw everything they'd been carefully not saying reflected back at him. So, he said, we saved 15,000 people, activated an ancient defense network, and proved that prophecies are just really old technical documentation. And now we need to convince my father and the Senate that an alliance between Earth and Verdania is our best chance against the swarm. She smiled. Think you can handle more diplomatic negotiations? Only if you promise to keep explaining Verdanian politics like they're particularly complicated tactical problems. I can do that. King Thuron stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, and suddenly he looked years younger. I believe, Commander Kane, that we have much to discuss about the future relationship between our peoples. I believe we do, Your Majesty. Outside the temple, the twin moons rose over Verdania's crystalline spires. The combined human Verdanian fleet patrolled the skies, a symbol of an alliance that had been forged not through politics or prophecy, but through mutual stubbornness and a shared refusal to let people die when they could be saved. Rena nudged Chen. You know they're going to be insufferable now, right? Oh, absolutely, Chen agreed, but at least it'll be entertaining. And as Caliph and Darius stood together in the Temple of First Light, already arguing about optimal fleet deployment strategies for the next engagement with the swarm, neither of them noticed the ancient texts on the wall glowing softly, or that the final line of the prophecy, the one that had been too faded to read for centuries, had suddenly become clear. And in the bond between frost and fire, ice and warmth, the impossible shall become inevitable. But prophecies, as Caliph had learned, were just suggestions anyway.